Aloha kako, welcome to Finding Our Futures. I'm John A. Sweeney with the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies. Today I am joined by Dr. William Kramer. He is a product of the Future Studies Center and the Department of Political Science at UH Manoa, but he is also a wildlife biologist who has a certificate in environmental studies and a master's in public administration.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, John.
And you have this amazing history and life story. I have this phenomenal bio in front of me. All I'm going to mention, just to plant the seed for the viewers at home and around the world, is two words: milking bats. But before we do that, I want to get into your recent work. You are also a bioethicist. You've taught at the International Space University.
Yeah.
You have a paper coming out looking at the environmental impact assessment of obviously dealing with off-planet space issues. So lots to cover, lots to talk about. But first of all, how you doing? How are your holidays?
I'm doing great, and holidays were great, and except for the battling the storm last night for those of you on Oahu here. But that was an adventure too. But,
right. Thankfully, we don't have a polar vortex to deal with, but otherwise we're doing okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So nice time to be in Hawaii.
Exactly. It's beautiful. It's a little breezy. You can't ask for better stuff. Okay. So before we do that, I want to mention to people watching that we have a new feature on ThinkTech Hawaii. You can tweet your questions to @ThinkTechHi. We'll take them live. We'll take time to address them. I promise we won't ignore them. So send us your questions. Again, we're going to be talking about bioethics, space exploration, looking at all of these key issues, and also just trying to get the story of William Kramer's life, which is pretty fantastic. So let's start off with a bit of a softball, or maybe not.
Okay.
How does a wildlife biologist, who I assume is very grounded in the workings of the Earth, move into bioethics and extraterrestrial life? How does that happen?
That's a good one. Yeah, I started off always wanting to be a biologist and being outside and loved the adventure of that, and was lucky enough to get a job working on that sort of thing. But as often those kinds of jobs do, it turned into more of a bureaucratic job and started dealing more with especially the Endangered Species Act. And somewhere around mid-career realized that what I was doing was not really wildlife biology anymore. It was dealing with political realities, dealing with budgets, personnel issues, management, and also the intersection of environmental laws with the reality of the environment or the unreality of the environment. So that's what drove me back to school to pick up a master's degree in the mid-1980s in public administration and political science, which was very useful for me as a biologist.
And so did you milk bats before that or after that?
Back to the milk, the bat milking. Yeah, I went to the University of Maryland, and right up the road from there is the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, which is what it was called back then. And I was hired on as a biotech, and one of the studies that was ongoing was looking at how pesticides got into bats. And of course, bats were flying around at night eating insects that had been treated with pesticides. And the study was looking at how was the pesticide transferred to the young. Was it either in utero when they were developing, or was it coming through the milk? So of course, in order to determine that, I'd get out my eyedropper, and every 4 hours, 24 hours a day, I would milk bats with an eyedropper, and then we would analyze the milk for various pesticides and heavy metals and things like that. So
that seems like the kind of professional and life skill that deserves its own line on a resume, right?
Well, it's not something you want to build a career around, but it was certainly a lot of fun when you're 20 years old.
Right.
So.
I'm sure it makes a number of appearances at cocktail parties.
Yeah, it's
okay,
a great one.
So we've addressed the bat milking. So now we can move to thinking about your current work, right? So you graduated a couple years ago with a Ph.D. from Department of Political Science in Manoa. Jim Dator, my advisor, was also your advisor. And so, and I have to say that to this day, Jim says that your dissertation presentation was one of, if not the most amazing, thorough, and engaging he has ever, in fact, been. And he's been doing that for about 40 years or so. And of course, my heart just sunk when I heard that. The bar is so high. But could you talk a little bit about your work and the kind of research you've done?
Yeah,
and sort of what's on your plate now?
Where to start this story is about 5 or 6 years ago, before I even considered going back to school, because I don't usually fit the demographic of someone returning to school when they're at that point 59 years old. But I was listening to National Public Radio, and there was a story on about the Mars program, and how one of the priorities at NASA was the search for extraterrestrial life. And right from the start, I really want to make it clear that what we're talking about here are microbial scale life, not aliens from Hollywood, and that's a big difference. So NASA was out looking for life on Mars and elsewhere in the solar system, and signs of past or present life. And coming from an endangered species background, one of the first ideas that popped into my head, questions, was, okay, if they do discover life, what will be the status, the legal status of that life? How will it be treated from an ethical point of view? On Earth here, of course, we have millennia of relationships that have built up between humans and the life that's around us. And a lot of cultural baggage associated with life and how we treat it. But if we find something that's totally new, that we've never experienced before, how then do we form a relationship with that life? Both an ethical relationship, how do we use it, or how do we not use it? And what should be our approach from a legal, political, ethical, even theological standpoint? So that sort of drove my interest, and I came back and talked to Jim Dator long before I decided to go into a doctoral program, and got some ideas from him about readings, and that sort of opened the door. And then once I went through that doorway, there was no turning back. I mean, it just became more and more fascinating the more I got into that aspect of it.
Right. Having had a similar through the looking glass experience with Jim, I understand completely. And to hear your story and how you came from doing wildlife biology to in this obvious field where you're dealing with the speculative potentiality, and futures is obviously a great safe space for that. And I'm sort of wondering, obviously certain questions prompt certain kinds of answers. So how is it that those types of questions are being framed now, and how do you see that discourse sort of shifting? Because obviously, and this is why we came up with the title for the show, 2014, the year we make contact, the types of discoveries that are being made on Mars and the types of speculative things that are being said about Titan, that life in a different kind of form, maybe one that we don't necessarily presume or would grant would to say it is life in this context, could very well exist, right? Or at least we're starting to see some of those seeds. Yeah.
One of the questions I asked NASA, the folks at NASA who are on top of this issue, is a couple questions actually. One is what is our relationship with what we may find, and secondly, how would we treat it from a ownership, I guess, perspective? And essentially, the answer is that there really isn't a fixed policy. So as far as right now, we are, and we being not only NASA, but European Space Agency and others, are looking for life and signs of life. But there are still a lot of questions as to what is life, how will we know life if we find it, and once we do find it, then will the same laws that apply here, for example, on Earth here, under certain circumstances in the United States, you can patent a bacterium. Would that same thing apply to Mars, for example? Especially if a private venture went to Mars, discovered something microscopic but a new organism, could they then patent it and essentially own that organism? And so those are unresolved issues. So when we talk about 2014 being the year of contact, we have to acknowledge that there's ongoing programs looking for life. And the more we learn about Mars and elsewhere in our solar system, and even outside our solar system, elsewhere in the galaxy, the higher the potential is that there is life, and that we may be discovering it at any time. So those kinds of issues really need to be addressed before we find it.
right? Using foresight, right? Which would
Exactly.
clearly be a
A
novelty.
good futures tool.
But it's something like you're saying is it's moving from sort of science fiction to science figuring it out. I know one of these, and you mentioned sort of corporate actors in space, right? Mars One recently said that out of the hundreds of thousands or maybe tens of thousands of applicants, that they whittled it down to about 1,500 people, right? And two are going to take this supposed one-way ticket. So these issues, obviously, again, are becoming more prescient in ways that maybe even a generation ago, maybe even 10 years ago, didn't seem like we should have had the kinds of conversations now that obviously, so in other words, this is a long time coming, but it also seems like there's a really pressing need as different actants move and different actors get involved in space.
10 years ago, it was science fiction. Now, well, more science fiction than we think of it now. Space, or Mars One, for example, is, if they hold to their schedule, is looking at putting people on Mars in 10 years, 2024, which when you think of the number 2024, it sounds like it's way far away. And then when you think 10 years, that's right around the corner. So you mentioned a paper I just finished. I've submitted it for publication, but I haven't gotten any reaction back from it yet, is looking at what kinds of environmental impact do we have if, for example, Mars One does put people on Mars in 10 years. And they start doing various activities up there, construction, for example, building things, moving dirt, moving rocks. Is there any kind of an environmental assessment process similar to the National Environmental Policy Act here on Earth that would not block or slow their actions, but consider the impacts of those actions before they're undertaken, so that we can make better choices? And right now, there doesn't appear to be any. So I think that's going to be a very significant issue certainly in the next 10 years, and maybe before that.
Right. And so obviously, like, out of the environmental direct impact, then we have to deal with the national, international, the geopolitical framework, right? So what types of international regulatory frameworks exist? Because immediately, obviously, the question is, if you're developing like a statutory language, or like, what does enforcement look like, right? I mean, how is it that you develop?
This is where space rangers come in, right?
Right. I mean, how do you actually develop a broader framework? I mean, because this isn't just happening with space. I mean, this is happening with the Arctic, right? This is happening with other areas where governments are starting to see, wow, new spaces are beginning to open up for a variety of forces and reasons, technological development, right? Environmental changes. So now we need to quickly get on the ball and figure this sort of stuff out. And claims are being made, and obviously it's exacerbated with space when you have corporations involved in the process, right? So what does that look like at the international scale and at that level?
Well, going back to way back in my youth, which is way long ago, there was something called IGY, International Geophysical Year, which was extremely bold. This was during the height of the Cold War, and I would have to guess that it was probably late 50s, and that's a guess, maybe 1958, 1960, somewhere around in there. And the United States and USSR were both competing heavily militarily, and through a stroke of brilliance among all those actors, they decided maybe a good way to work together would be to create what they called the International Geophysical Year, where the US, USSR, and a whole suite of other nations all cooperated on some various geological problems. And one of these was Antarctica, which had been, of course, known about for a couple of hundred years, but had just become a point of interest. And of course, there is no national ownership. There are no national claims there. So part of what came out of that initiative was the Antarctic Treaty. And the Antarctic Treaty set up Antarctica as a non-militarized area, and started to address how various countries would cooperate and assist each other with research. Very shortly after that, of course, President Kennedy's famous statement in the early 1960s that the United States would put men on the moon by the end of the decade through another curve ball into that mix. And so feeding off of the Antarctic Treaty, the United States, the USSR, and others decided that they should come up with some protocol like the Antarctic Treaty to address issues in space. And the main concerns here were that it wouldn't become a military base. And so that was primary. And then secondary to that would be that if any particular country did launch vehicles into space and land on the moon or elsewhere, that there would be some reciprocity, that if there were emergencies, one country would help another.
Right.
And out of that came the Outer Space Treaty in 1967, I believe.
So it sounds like there's been a little bit of
68.
a framework for creating some of these regulatory governance systems.
Correct.
There's been. Okay. All right. So we're going to pause for a break. We'll hear
Okay.
more about that in just a second. You're watching Think Tech Live, Finding Our Futures. I'm John A. Sweeney from the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies, also joined by Dr. William Kramer, product of the same program in the same department. We're chatting about bioethics, about space. You missed stuff about milking bats. Maybe we'll get back to that in a little bit. Stick
we
with
won't.
us. We'll be back in a flash.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Hori for Think Tech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Hori. Mahalo.
Aloha and welcome back to Finding Our Futures. I'm John A. Sweeney with the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies. Today we're chatting with Dr. William Kramer, bioethicist, wildlife biologist, all-around Renaissance man. I won't mention the other part. And he was mentioning how we start to see these emergent frameworks in the context of space, and obviously we're seeing lots of changes given by the new actors who are involved in space exploration, space development, space projects, but there is a long history of the kind of international forums for cooperation. A lot of that has to do with, you were mentioning, developing regulatory governance frameworks for places like Antarctica. So you were saying that the development sort of out of the Cold War was to actually create some sort of framework for cooperation.
Correct. And the focus of the Outer Space Treaty, again, was non-militarization. And then it began to get into a little bit of the kinds of things I'm more interested in, the biological aspects, because it was recognized early on that something else all countries really needed to agree to was to limit the potential for us for doing two things, both called forward contamination and backward contamination. And forward contamination would be, for example, if we send a rocket off to the moon and it's full of bacteria and other kinds of organisms, that we would, for lack of a better term, contaminate or pollute that environment. And we want to guard against that. And a little bit closer to home, and this was very important during the Apollo missions, where the first people actually walked on the moon and returned, was backward contamination. We wanted to ensure that if there were organisms on the moon or Mars or elsewhere, that we didn't bring those back into the Earth environment. So, for example, when the first astronauts returned from the moon, they were held in quarantine for a number of days to ensure that they had not brought something hitchhiking back with them on the spacecraft, which was a lot of fodder for science fiction movies in the 50s and 60s.
Right.
So there was that aspect of biological, that was sort of the first entrance of biology into thinking about regulating space. But even until today, forward and backward contamination are the predominant issues. So when any country launches a vehicle that's going to be landing or crashing intentionally or not, they have to ensure certain standards are met as far as the cleanliness of that vehicle. Sometimes it's sterile, which is a difficult criteria to reach. Other times it's measured in the number of bacterium per cubic centimeter or per square centimeter on that vehicle. And even the Mars rover that's up there right now, the Mars Science Laboratory, the rover Curiosity, has very few bacteria on it. It was described as there are more bacteria on the surface of your palm of your hand than are on that lander. There was an issue when that vehicle took off that it was contaminated beyond their intended standards, but they redirected where the mission was going to land to an area that may not be quite as biologically sensitive or have the same potential. So NASA felt somewhat comfortable in meeting standards, but they were only able to meet those standards by redirecting the Curiosity to the Gale crater, which is closer to the equator of Mars than to some areas where there might be ice and potential water. And that's the main thing they want to guard against, contaminating those environments.
Right. So you mentioned how obviously the concerns about biology had a lot to do with the question of contamination. And so one of the, I guess, key issues is that, at least from my perspective, a question is if we're already thinking about the context for bacteria or thinking about life potentially with that caveat already introduced, what sort of limits have we already imposed, or how have we already framed the nature of that discourse given the kinds of concerns that we have? And obviously backward contamination, as you mentioned, was fodder for sci-fi and horror films, but clearly forward contamination is just as much of a critical issue, especially when we consider the potentiality for disruption of a variety of a different type of form of life, right? A difference in kind, not a difference in degree.
Yeah. One of the issues that has always sort of been running in the background since we started a space program is that there is no one definition of what constitutes life. And here we begin to migrate from the biological, technical, scientific aspects into the more philosophical. And there are, depending on who you talk to, people will have different definitions of what constitutes life. And what we are launching into space in from a philosophical perspective, is a Western definition of life. There are indigenous belief systems that would recognize life as something very different than what a traditional Western view of life is. So one way of thinking about this, that I might be talking myself out on the end of a limb here, but if you look at the reverse of it, the way that our definition of death has changed, even within Western philosophy in the last 100 years. A person was considered dead if they weren't breathing and if you couldn't hear a heartbeat. Okay, that no longer applies. Now we know someone can be still very much alive at that point, but sustained through artificial means. So then it became, from that to what you hear about now, brain dead. Well, someone is brain dead. So the definitions of death are changing, and also the definitions of life are also changing. So what we are looking for right now with our space programs are something that resembles Earth life. That it is a carbon-based form like we are, that it uses various metabolic pathways the same way that Earth life does. And if we run into that kind of a system on Mars or on Enceladus or Jupiter's moon Europa, which I'd like to talk a little bit about, but if we run into something totally different, we may be looking for something that's green when actually it's blue. And we might miss it, because especially if we're sending up robotics They are looking for specific signatures of life. And just as a quick example for that, the Viking mission, which went to Mars back, and here I'm guessing again, in the late 1970s, I think, had a life-seeking scientific package on board. And they would scoop up samples of soil, warm it slightly, add some nutrients to the soil, and then monitor the gases given off by that sample to see if it looked like there was some kind of metabolism going on. And the assumptions that were made is that the nutrients that we added, which would kickstart life here on Earth, that would work with a Martian organism, that warming it would be a good thing because it would speed up metabolism. Well, that may or may not be true. If you took a human and warmed them up to 180 degrees, that might not be the best thing to do. And also, this experiment lasted 8 days. And at the end of the 8 days, the assumption was, well, if this life hadn't responded within 8 days, then there was no life there. And the question, of course, immediately comes up, well, we're using Earth-based assumptions about time. So not only assumptions about the biology of extraterrestrial organisms, but assumptions about the kind of time scale that they work on. Since then, we've discovered bacteria here on Earth that may live hundreds of years because their metabolism is so slow that if you observe them for 6 months, you don't see anything happening. You assume possibly that they're dead or that they never were alive. But it's just that they're working on a different time scale than we're used to. So there it begins to migrate over to a philosophical, you begin to ask philosophical questions at that point.
Right, and you mentioned even, I think, more sort of not necessarily uniquely, but more, it's certainly from my perspective, more interestingly, is how there are theological implications and consequences to thinking about not just breaking down, obviously, a predominant sort of, Western perspectivism within the sort of like scientific, framing, but the issue of, like you're saying, reframing life and death. And obviously, we're talking about their cosmological consequences, right? For thinking about
Absolutely.
how we frame the kinds of questions and, again, the kinds of answers we come up with.
First encounters are going to be a lot more significant than I think most people would realize. And you were talking about theological aspects of it. The Western paradigm for looking at life, at least a predominant one in science, is that sometime several billion years ago, from the quote-unquote primordial soup of the early Earth, non-living components of chemistry, of organic chemistry, began to replicate and made that transition from non-living to living organisms, and through what's called chemical evolution. So you went from a chemical into a living organism at some point along that continuum, somewhere about 4 billion years ago. And so a lot of science is directed at looking at when did that occur, what exactly was the difference, how did we make the transition from non-living to living? Other perspectives, perhaps Buddhist perspectives, find that to be an irrelevant question, because what is important under other philosophies might be, at what point do living things become sentient? At what point do something that is unable to experience its environment directly begin to experience that? And that fits under perhaps a more, and you'd probably be better to answer this than me, but fits under that Buddhist perspective. So it's where you draw lines that becomes important. And a significant part of my dissertation was looking at, as we approach extraterrestrial life and determining our bioethical relationship with that life, from a Western perspective, we're looking at, okay, where do we draw the line between where we give this thing some consideration and where we disregard it. So again, we're applying a history of our relationship with Earth life and trying to impose that on something that's totally new.
Right, and who gets to draw the line?
And who gets to draw
with
the
what
line.
instrument? And right.
Yeah.
Okay, fascinating stuff. So we're going to take another break. We'll be back in a flash. More with Dr. William Kramer, wildlife biologist, bioethicist, all-around Renaissance man. This is Finding Our Futures. I'm Johnny Sweeney with the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies. You're watching Think Tech Live. Please tweet us your questions at ThinkTechHigh. We'll be back in a flash. Stay tuned.
We want to thank our underwriters.
Hawaiian Electric Company and its affiliates Maui Electric on Maui and Hawaii Electric Light Company on Hawaii Island are deeply committed to the communities they serve.
Galen Ho is a senior executive of BAE Systems, a global defense, security, and aerospace company.
The High-Tech Development Corporation, the state's leading technology agency, attached to the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism.
Castle and Cook Hawaii, with a time-honored legacy that spans more than 160 years and revolves around its mission of investing in Hawaii, creating communities, and providing for the needs of our state.
Hawaii Gas, formerly the Gas Company, a proponent of the Liquefied Natural Gas Initiative, helping Hawaii achieve its transition to clean energy and a better energy future.
Collateral Analytics, a Hawaii-based tech company empowering the real estate industry with greater and faster access to the tools and data they need to make better informed property investment decisions.
I'm Nicole Hori. Thanks so much for joining us on Think Tech.
I'm Maria Kashem. See you next time.
Aloha kako, welcome back to Finding Our Futures. I'm Johnny Sweeney with the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies, talking today with Dr. William Kramer about his research into space, bioethics, how we engage with extraterrestrial life, and the sort of ethico-political, onto-theological, we can just keep going on and on, existential types of questions that we need to ask, obviously, so we can apply foresight. So if, and let me rephrase, when in fact we have an encounter, we're able then to prudently move forward. And obviously the sort of, I think, frame of reference is to think about the forms of colonization or the colonial encounters, right? And to use that as a metric for clearly what we don't want to do. We don't want, obviously, to be in a space or a place where, like you're saying, we find ourselves, just by the very questions or the lines that we're drawing, already negating other forms of life simply because we've approached it from this way. So
Right.
I want to come back and mention an article that I saw, something that came across my radar, kind of was a buzz a little bit in some science journals, with this question about what I assume is referred to as sort of the two-planet life or the planet seeding theory, right? Where we know that there have been meteorites from Mars, right, through volcanic activity that have landed here. So some argue
Right.
that you need both parts, right? It's this sort of like sperm and egg thing. So Mars was the sperm seeder, so to speak, and the Earth being the fertile space, the goo, right? So what do you make of that? Is that hold water? Where do you see that fitting into the discourse?
Yeah, I mean, there's, pardon me one second. Yeah, one thing that is done every Arctic or Antarctic summer is go down there and look around for meteorites. They're relatively easy to spot because they're generally dark and they're on snow, so you can find them. And back in 1984 or 1985, there was one meteorite that looked like it might have signs of bacterial skeletons in this meteorite, and it caused quite a stir back then. As it was eventually determined that most likely it wasn't. It was just a mineral signature. But that sort of generated this idea about Earth being seeded from life elsewhere, and that's definitely a possibility. That still doesn't answer how life gets started initially. The converse of that, of course, is that Earth life might be ejected into space either through natural or through human causes and start seeding elsewhere. There's a group called the Panspermia Society, which takes the point of view that is an obligation of humans to spread life through the universe, and I don't agree with that. But one of their proposals was that we should be packaging up various Earth organisms and just blasting them in a shotgun fashion throughout the galaxy in hopes that they'll land on some other fertile planet and start growing. And I would say that's about the least ethical thing that you could do. Because if you look at the reciprocal, that means that someone who's on another planet in our galaxy could blast their organisms, might land here on Earth and might work, and it might not. But I think the risks are pretty high there.
Right. So that would be the shoot first and ask questions
Exactly.
later theory of space exploration. Okay. So just as a reminder, folks, you at home around the world, you can tweet us your questions at ThinkTechHigh, and we will take them live. So okay, thank you. That clears some things up. But obviously, well, go ahead.
Oh, there's one thing I'd like to interject here too, and that is that something you announced, well, just at the beginning of this segment. Again, the language that we use in how we approach space is very telling. And I think most of the people watching hear these kinds of terms and we accept them, usually without thinking. We talk about the conquest of space. Conquest is definitely a militaristic term. It's, we talk about space environments as being harsh and extreme, and that we are characterizing places where we can't necessarily live comfortably as something to be conquered. And once you establish that mindset, it forgives a whole bunch of sins. Then it allows you to more easily go there and do all kinds of adverse actions. And so part of what I'm interested in is that making sure our approach is a little bit more docile, I guess is one way of putting it.
And so earlier you mentioned, obviously, there's a very ripe conversation for philosophical, theological, religious perspectives. Are there religious communities participating within this ethical dialogue? I mean, is this discourse dominated by PhDs, academics, scientists, or do you find other people, are they going to these other communities and seeking out these other perspectives?
Great question. And it's, the answer is yes. The work of SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which operates out of Mountain View, California, just south of San Francisco, they have a very legitimate astrobiology function, and they work very closely with NASA. And part of what they are doing is starting an astrobiology and society outreach program. And that's been ongoing now for, I'm guessing here, at least 6, 7, maybe more years. Margaret Race is head of that program at SETI. Catherine Denning at York University in Canada has been very much into that. And what they are doing is opening dialogue among not only astrophysicists, astronomers, engineers that have sort of, the space program is sort of built from that perspective, but they're opening the doors to a lot of other perspectives, including theology. And I went to a meeting there, I guess it's been about 3 or 4 years ago, and met all different kinds of people with different viewpoints about how do we go about exploration in space, what are the cultural aspects of that search, and what are the theological implications. So one fellow that I met, unfortunately I can't remember his name, but he was with the Vatican Observatory. And in talking with him, from a Catholic perspective, he said that if life were to be discovered on Mars, that as far as the Vatican's approach would be, that would fit very well within their philosophy, within their theology. There would be no real conflict. Other groups would have more problems with that from a theological viewpoint. So that kind of dialogue is ongoing, and if any of the viewers wanted to look that up, Astrobiology and Society, and just the acronym SETI, S-E-T-I, and I'm sure that that would lead them to all kinds of connections there.
Interesting. And clearly the Vatican is a little bit more hip now that we've got the new Pope. Technically we have two popes, right? We have a former Pope. That's
Pope Emeritus.
That's a different show, right? Okay, we're going to take another break. Stick with us. We have a bit more to talk about with Dr. William Kramer, bioethicist, wildlife biologist, all-around Renaissance man, and clearly an expert on space and dealing with the ethical, political issues of extraterrestrial life. You're watching Finding Our Futures on Think Tech Live. I'm John Sweeney. We'll be back in a flash.
Aloha, I'm Jay Fidel. This is Think Tech Hawaii, broadcasting live from the Pioneer Plaza in downtown Honolulu. We raise public awareness about tech, energy, and globalism in Hawaii. Technology is critical to our state. A vibrant tech sector will give us new prospects in the global marketplace and will offer great careers and make our economy more resilient. Streaming live on Ustream and Spreaker, Think Tech allows its hosts and guests invaluable opportunities to report important events and discuss important questions, and to be heard here in Hawaii and around the world. You can find links to our live streams on thinktechhawaii.com or on our mobile website, m.thinktechhawaii.com. And you can see our archive on YouTube. It's all just a click away. We want to do whatever we can to keep Hawaii relevant, connected, and thriving in the complexity of the 21st century. We hope you will help us in those efforts. Tune in today. This is Think Tech. I'm Jay Fidel. Mahalo.
Aloha kako, welcome back to Finding Our Futures. I'm John A. Sweeney with the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies. We've been chatting today with Dr. William Kramer, bioethicist, all-around Renaissance man, wildlife biologist. You spent time in the Navy as well, seen the world.
As short a period of time as possible.
Okay.
That's another program.
Now, we've heard the amazing story about you milking bats, and obviously and very clearly, you earned every ounce of that Ph.D. in future studies focusing on bioethics and extraterrestrial life. But I understand that you have a very good story about polar bears.
That goes right along with the, one of my other careers was I was a zookeeper at National Zoo in Washington, D.C. for a year with the both primates and large carnivore division, and just another bizarre thing that I have to
do. They call it that, the large carnivore?
Large
division?
Carnivore, yeah.
That sounds terrifying.
So one of my many duties there was we had a polar bear whose name was Snowstar, I won't forget that, who was named by a contest, but she had an ear infection. So one of the jobs was to put salve in her ear, which is not easy to do with a polar bear that does not want to have something rammed in her ear. So that was one of my many other anecdotal things that I've done in my short life. But yeah, so a zookeeper for a while, and that was all part of getting into the wildlife biology field.
It sounds a bit like a vignette from a Mel Brooks film. I'm imagining you with this giant Q-tip with this hopefully sedated polar bear.
No, unsedated.
Unsedated
Very active.
Wow.
Yeah.
That definitely merits hazard pay, I would imagine. Okay, so one of the other things I wanted to hit on before we sort of have to shut it down is you obviously are thinking about these critical issues about how we deal with and encounter life, and clearly now we're on the cusp of terraforming proposals in ways that we never were before. And we were trying to get this project off the ground to do a panel at this conference, and interestingly, even what I think is a very broad group, we didn't get the official response saying why, but perhaps it was a little too science fiction-y. So how do you see people responding to your work? Which is to say that between futurists, this is sure just another Monday conversation about extraterrestrial life and bioethics, but how do you see the dialogue going beyond not people who necessarily accept it, but who understand and realize the potential consequences of this? So how do you see that engaging in a public discourse? I mean, where is that discourse taking place in a public context? And how is that sort of shaping up?
It's only partly optimistic, I think, from my point of view. The industry, and I use that word very decidedly, the industry of space is an industry. It is a capitalist venture. It is out to for political as well as industrial purposes, and it's still, for many good reasons. I'm not trying to denigrate this, but it's still run mainly by engineers and people from the aerospace industry. So there is a big call for expansion of space programs because it's good for business. And there's nothing wrong with that. But that is the predominant paradigm in the way people think about this approach. So when you come in and start to look at some of the social, societal, ethical points of view, it's like, and again, I'm overgeneralizing here, but you're entering the domain of engineers and you're saying, now let's just slow down just a little and think about the implications of what you're doing. And engineers tend to think in a very longitudinal manner, and it does not fit well with social aspects, political aspects, cultural aspects. So there's resistance there, because it's often perceived that the social implications is going to slow or redirect their work. And so there's some conflict there. But it's a gradual learning process on both sides of that equation.
Yeah,
So.
and I would throw policymakers into that mix as well, right?
Yeah.
They tend to make linear steps, and clearly as futurists with projects we've both worked on, you have to get people to think about non-linear effects, right? About to take well, they're truly existential, exponential steps, right? In a variety of changes, and then to find ways of making sense of those feedback loops, and then coming up with new iterations of what kinds of steps do we take given these types of challenges and opportunities. So where do you see yourself in the next 5-10 years? What's on your plate?
Well, I am working on a couple papers. I just finished this one on taking the National Environmental Policy Act and building a parallel kind of regulation to apply to extraterrestrial impacts. And I think that's needed. I've just started last week, just before Christmas, working on a paper that's looking at, the working title is Giving Voice to the Voiceless, Giving Voice to ET. And again, drawing on my endangered species background. If we were to encounter life, would they have any legal rights? Would they have any standing in court, for example? And one way that species and even landscapes gain standing in courts in the United States and elsewhere is by having an advocacy group of humans who have an interest in them to speak for them in a legal sense. And a lot of this comes out of Christopher Stone's work. If anyone is I would strongly recommend anyone interested in this read Do Trees Have Standing by Christopher Stone, which I think he wrote it in 1975, and it greatly influenced me back then about breaking beyond this barrier of thinking about humans as being the only actors involved. And there are landscapes and landscape features that now have standing in court. They can sue you. You can be sued by a river. So one thing that we need to do before life is discovered is to show that there is an interest among humans as to the implications of our actions on that life. So something I want to carry forward after I finish this paper is to try to push for that, to get a little bit more voice there. And then next project after that is I've always been toying with a paper called Leopold on Mars. And this isn't Leopold of the Belgian Congo infamy, but that could happen too. But Aldo Leopold.
Sand County Almanac, it's a great text.
Was it 48 or 1949, his Sand County Almanac. And he is closely linked with the concept of a land ethic, from a Western perspective. And so what I would like to do is explore a little bit, how would Aldo Leopold react if he were on Mars, as far as humans' relationship with the Martian landscape? Would it be the same as humans' relationship with landscape on Earth? And in conversing with some scholars who study Leopold and are the experts, they have said that, well, he probably wouldn't react, wouldn't consider that there would be a Mars ethic because humans aren't from Mars. Well, that's putting on our futurist hats.
Right.
40 years from now, we may be seeing humans that are very much part of the Martian landscape. Certainly 200 years from now, hopefully.
Even if we consider them humans, right? Even if they're
even if
they're beyond
right.
that. Well, we're going to have to leave it there, Dr. Kramer.
Thank you very much,
again.
John.
Dr. William Kramer today, the guest, Finding Our Futures, bioethicist, wildlife biologist, all around Renaissance man, bat milker. I had to throw that in. So thanks for joining us today. Feel free to shoot us your questions still. We'll respond if we can at ThinkTech High. This is Finding Our Futures. You're watching ThinkTech Live, and we'll see you next week. Aloha.